Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. It is wonderful to see you. My name is Ada McElroy with Carney Sando & Associates. It is an honor and privilege to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Dr. Cornel West. Dr. West is a professor of the practice of public philosophy at Harvard University and holds the title of Professor Emeritus at Princeton University. He has also taught at Union Theological Seminary, Yale, and the University of Paris. The son of an elementary school educator and a U.S. Air Force administrator, he graduated magna cum laude from Harvard and obtained his master's degree and PhD in philosophy from Princeton. Dr. West is the author of 20 books, including his classics, Race Matters and Democracy Matters, as well as his memoir, Brother West, Living and Loving Out Loud. He's a frequent guest on CNN, C-SPAN, and Democracy Now!, and has appeared in over 25 documentaries and films. Dr. West has also produced 3 spoken word albums, including Never Forget, A Journey of Revelations, featuring collaborations with guest artists Prince, Jill Scott, Andre 3000, Talib Kweli, KRS-One, and the late Gerald Levert. In his book, Hope on a Tightrope, Dr. West wrote, "We choose to be certain kinds of human beings. That is why those who choose to love and serve have a calling and not a career. When we dare to love and serve, we will be willing to speak, act, dialogue, write, fuse, share, laugh, and love with others whom we can inspire and who can inspire us." Through his democratic advocacy, revolutionary scholarship, and educational engagement, it is clear that Dr. West's unwavering commitment to empowering others will continue to inspire generations to come. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Cornel West.
Thank you so very much. What a blessing, what an honor, what a privilege to be here. I want to salute each and every one of you for being a force for good and constituting the leaven in a very, very delicate democratic loaf that's in very deep trouble. I want to begin by saluting my dear sister, Ada McElroy, for those kind words, for your magnificent work. Let's give it up for her. Kim Garner, visionary, courageous, persistent. Thank you so very much. And for my new brother, President Devereaux McClatchy. It's good to see you. It's been 18, 19 years there in that class at Harvard Divinity School. I tell you, you represent the best of Harvard. Thank you so very much, my brother. There's a very special person here who grew up in Sacramento, California. She's a distinguished professor at Johns Hopkins University. I want her to stand, Professor Katrina McDonald. Where is she? There she is. And I want to begin with Sacramento. I want to begin on a personal note that I am who I am because somebody loved me. Somebody cared for me. Somebody attended to me. For me, education is not a formal process. It's profoundly existential. And the fact that I was the second son of Irene and Clifton West is much more important than my going to Harvard or teaching at Yale or Princeton, University of Paris, because it's a way in which I was able to become spiritually fortified to deal with the Harvards and the Yales and the Princetons and the University of Paris is very important. The same is true with my church, Shiloh Baptist Church on the chocolate side of Sacramento, California. The Reverend Willie P. Cook is my pastor. We had pastors, not CEOs in those days. We had choirs and not praise teams. And we had strong prison ministries. We were weak on building fund. And our preacher drove a Volkswagen for 31 years. That's Reverend Willie P. Cook. But when it came to outreach for prisoners, the elderly, and especially the priceless young people, and I was one of the priceless young people. I was a gangster before I met Jesus, and I became a redeemed sinner with gangster proclivities. And that's what I am to this day. People get upset when they see me on television. I say, oh, my dear brother Donald Trump is a gangster in character and a neo-fascist in content. They say, brother, well, you shouldn't use that kind of language. I say, no, describing somebody as a gangster is not a subjective expression. It's an objective description in terms of the actions they say they're going to do. When you take somebody's oil, we go into Iraq to take oil, that's gangster. You grabbing a woman's private parts, that's gangster. So I'm not name calling and finger pointing when I'm talking about Brother Trump. I'm talking about what I learned in Vacation Bible School in Shiloh Baptist Church, of what it means to try to be a human being undergoing what the Greeks call paideia, P-A-I-D-E-I, which you all are wrestling with every day. Deep education, not cheap schooling. And there's a fundamental qualitative difference. And no democracy can survive. We learned that from Walt Whitman. We learned that from Henry David Thoreau. We learned that from Muriel Rukeyser. We learned that from John Dewey. No democracy can survive with an educational process more and more reduced to schooling and unable to generate young people of integrity, honesty, decency, and courage, willing to make democracy something that can be sustained rather than just talked about in the abstract as oligarchs rule. My dear brother, Barack Obama, who I have a tremendous respect for in terms of his brilliance and charisma, when he said in 2004, America is a magical place, I said, this brother's going to have a Christopher Columbus experience. He's going to discover America. Ain't nothing magical about America. America is free and democratic to the degree to which each generation has courageous, visionary folk to keep it free and democratic. America can go neo-fascist like any other society. Nothing exceptional in terms of America being on automatic, always a moral example of liberty. Not at all. Not at all. You can lose it. And you lose it in one generation, and it takes 12 generations to build. What Sinclair Lewis saw in 1935 in his novel, It Can't Happen Here. That's in part what Dick Rorty was talking about, my dear teacher, friend, and colleague. You see, what happens when the strong man scapegoats the most vulnerable, afraid to confront the most powerful, brings in a pseudo-populist discourse on the one hand, concerned about those Sly Stone called everyday people, but really connected to the billionaires and the military generals, and getting ready for war as a way of unifying a citizenry that's more and more fragmented and polarized and balkanized. Now, I come from a people, a great people, been terrorized and traumatized and stigmatized for 400 years, psychically, spiritually, economically, politically, hated and yet taught the world so much about how to love. We here in Philadelphia, I could just turn on John Coltrane's The Love Supreme and take my seat. Just sit down. Listen closely to every note in The Love Supreme. He's talking about paideia. How do we undergo transformation in such a way that, lo and behold, we learn how to die in order to learn how to live. And you learn how to die when we convinced our young folk that they need to call into question certain assumptions and presuppositions, call into question certain prejudices and prejudgments. And once you give it up and turn it loose the way James Brown talked about it, give up that white supremacy, give up that male supremacy, give up that anti-Jewish, that anti-Arab, that anti-Palestinian, that anti-woman, that anti-gay, anti-lesbian sensibility. You got to give it up And when you give it up, you're undergoing fundamental transformation. Something in you is dying so that something can emerge and you become more mature, more courageous, more compassionate. There is no rebirth without death. Education is about learning how to die. I told my students that for 40 years now. Each time they come in my class. You here to learn how to die. I thought I was just trying to get a grade in the philosophy class. No. I come from a tradition of a people who've been on intimate terms with catastrophe, intimate terms with death, the social death of slavery, the civic death of Jim Crow, the psychic death of being taught to hate yourself and told you have the wrong lips and hips and hair texture and skin color, and the spiritual death of being told that in a white supremacist civilization, black love is a crime. Ask John Brown, he'll tell you. He fell in love with black people. And he died because he tried to emancipate and liberate the best of his ability. That black history is a curse. Black freedom is a pipe dream. And black hope is a joke. That's what black folk were told every generation, 244 years in which it was against the law for black people to learn how to read and write, against the law for black people to worship God without white supervision, and stole away at night in a ring shout, holding hands and lifted voices and said, lo and behold, given this hate, we are still going to refuse to hate back. And most of them opted for Christian stories, so they engaged in charitable Christian hatred, which is a hatred of the sin and a love of the sinner. And that's a difficult and delicate way of being in the world. That's where Martin Luther King Jr. comes from. That's where Toni Morrison's Beloved comes from. That's where James Baldwin's love-soaked essays come from. Take that mask off. Love forces us to take off the mask we know we cannot live within, but fear we cannot live without. Quit laughing when it ain't funny and scratching when it don't itch. Take off the mask. Straighten your back up. But recognize that you are confronting catastrophic circumstances. There's 244 years of slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow Senior, which was a species of American terrorism in which every 2.5 days, some black body was hanging from some tree that the great Billie Holiday sang about with such power, and the Jewish brother Maripol writing the lyrics. And now we're living in Jim Crow Jr., still dealing with the shadow of that earlier catastrophe. And as educators, we have the audacity to say that in the face of catastrophe, we are going to keep track of the humanity of our precious students, no matter what color, no matter what class, sexual orientation, national identity, because they are human beings. And we are going to do all we can to touch their souls and hearts and minds. And it's not a question of indoctrination. My tradition tells me to lift every voice. No echoes here. Part of the challenge of our young people is they live in a culture, a market-driven culture, obsessed with brands, obsessed with status, obsessed with celebrity. All they want to do is just get over or be obsessed with the 11th commandment, thou shalt not get caught. The cult of success, the superficial culture of spectacle and image, what appears to be the case. Just make sure that your brand is in place. Just make sure that your PR people are smart. Just make sure that your spinsters are in place for you to be successful. That's not what I learned in Sacramento. I was told from the very beginning, you must be great. And greatness has nothing to do with Alexander the Great. It has to do with Amos and Isaiah and Jesus and Martin Luther King Jr. and Dorothy Day and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and Grace Boggs, those who are mustering the courage, empathy, and imagination to create some alternative view of the world such that in service, maybe you can leave the world just a little better than you found it. That's what greatness is. That's Fannie Lou Hamer. That's Eleanor Roosevelt. And our young people more and more told just to be successful. That's what it is. And then walked red carpet like a peacock so that everybody can see how smart you are and how rich you are and what your trophy spouse looks like and what your mansion looks like. And I could hear Harriet Tubman saying, peacocks strut because they can't fly. We don't need peacocks who strut. We don't need foliage that titillates people. We need fruit that have impact on people's hearts and minds and souls. And part of the spiritual warfare against our young people of all color these days is to keep that cult of success dangling in their faces so they can grab it by any means necessary. That's not what Malcolm X had in mind. Malcolm X comes from the legacy of Jerusalem, where our precious Jewish brothers and sisters taught us to be human is to spread hesed, loving kindness to orphan, widow, fatherless, motherless, weak, vulnerable, poor, those who are marginalized. And by any means necessary means mustering every ounce in your heart and mind and soul and intellect to try to pass it on to the younger generation to enable and empower them so that they can lift their voices, not in imitation of you, but like their fingerprint, their voice is uniquely theirs. Nobody can raise any voice other than the voice that we have. And that voice is connected to joy, not pleasure. So much of contemporary culture is a joyless quest for pleasure. Because pleasure is insatiable. Joy is empowering at its deepest level. And I've been blessed to teach in prisons for 37 years. When I started, we had 280,000 folk. Today we got 2.5 million. Unbelievable transformation in the experience of young people, especially poor young people of all colors, and disproportionately chocolate poor young people. And that's a sign of what? Our young folk pick up the sign. They say, oh, we see this cult of success is really about producing people who are very smart but well-adjusted to injustice. Very smart but well-adapted to indifference. Coarse and conscious, hardened hearts, unconcerned about the 1 out of 2. You all wrestle with this all the time. 1 out of 2 children of color under 6 live in poverty in the richest nation in the history of the world. That's spiritually obscene. That's morally disgraceful. Where's the discourse on it? Didn't see it in the campaign either party. Martin Luther King Jr. turns over in his grave. He died trying to bring poor people together, telling the truth about what was going on to Vietnamese babies with bombs dropped there, but also landing in ghettos as that transfer of wealth went to military as opposed to education and jobs with a living wage and decent housing. And our young folk are very, very insightful. They say, oh, we see. This is just about getting over by any means. This is gangster. And we say, no, we want to democratize. We don't want to gangsterize. But you can't democratize without unbelievable commitment to democratic paideia. To democratic education. And democratic education is about each and every student and individual, personality, soul, being attended to. Attended to. So we could argue that democracy is about the formation of attention, that wonderful phrase of Simone Weil. The formation of attention. There's a wonderful book that I highly recommend by Tim Wu called The Attention Merchants. Just came out about a year ago. It's about the ways in which the advertising agencies and the corporate media and other institutions are fighting for the attention, especially of young people, to turn them into consumers, to have their bodies titillated so they want to buy and sell in order to reproduce the economy and what it means to be a citizen, let alone what it means to be a critically compassionate human being, drops out. And the formation of attention going all the way back to Plato. Plato says what? Paideia is about the turning of the soul to shift from things that are superficial but that we attend to and attend to the things that matter. What's really at stake? That's the difference between the sophists and Socrates. Thrasymachus is playing the game in order to have money and arguing might is right. Socrates is saying what? Everything is at stake in terms of the kind of human being I want to be, the kind of human being our young people will choose to be. In terms of their individual lives, everything is at stake, their structures of feeling and value, but also in terms of the democracy and just how fragile it is. How do we intervene so we can engage in that turning of the soul of young folk that say what you ought to attend to is integrity, honesty, decency, courage. What you ought to attend to is critical reflection about your assumptions. What you ought to attend to is ways in which you can generate forms of self-confidence and self-respect. Oh, how difficult it is. You all know better than I, cutting against the grain every day among the young folk. And at the same time, having to shatter what I call neoliberal soulcraft. See, neoliberal ideology is if you have a problem, you financialize, privatize, and militarize. And it's hard to keep track of the public good. Now, each context can be used for good, but part of the neoliberal soulcraft that flows from it is a cult of smartness that marginalizes wisdom. It's a cult of getting rich that marginalizes a commitment to social justice. And more these days, it's difficult for young people to get in contact with traditions that are tied to wisdom and courage and compassion, as opposed to smartness, big money, and status. And no democracy can survive, especially a democracy like this one with an empire. With an empire. It's so easy to become so indifferent. The great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel say, indifference to evil is more insidious than evil itself. Becomes a form of life, a mode of being in the world. And our educational institutions can easily become places where we think we are so smart and learned, but it is shot through with forms of ignorance and arrogance and indifference. So in the name of being so smart, we are reproducing some of the worst. And all you have to do these days as part of the cult of the smartness, just watch television and watch how many times the pundits use the word obviously. Obviously. No, it's not obvious at all. Obviously. Oh, it's not just a hedge word. That's part of the culture of smartness. But it's an in-crowd word. Because if it's obvious to them, it's not obvious to you. You the one who's viewed as ignorant. It's not obvious at all. You need to come up with another word to make your connectives It's obvious that we shouldn't have a dialogue on drone strikes as children are killed in Somalia and Yemen and Afghanistan and Pakistan because nobody's doing it. You see? Oh, it's just obvious that we shouldn't have a serious interrogation of Wall Street power. It's just obvious that somehow not one Wall Street executive went to jail after all of those crimes, insider trading and market manipulation and predatory lending. It's just obvious because that's the way I rule. But let Jamal or Juanita or Paul McGillicuddy get caught with crack. Gone straight to jail. It's nothing obvious at all. We need to be Socratic. What is wonderful about Socrates is what? Nothing's obvious for him. Well, everybody knows what piety is. No, I'm reading the Youth of Freud. I don't know what piety is. What is justice? I don't know. Let's wrestle with it in Republic. What is courage? Let's read the Locke. I know Socrates, you're not providing us any kind of clear, obvious definition. That's right. That's called education. Or my own tradition. My own tradition that says, lo and behold, what strikes you as so solid is actually your boot on my neck. Oh, your democracy seems to be so lovely and magnificent and stable. Well, you got 22% of the inhabitants of the 13 colonies who are enslaved Africans who are providing free labor from sunrise to sun up, tortured every day, only live to be 27 years old. They are producing the one commodity that becomes the global commodity, cotton itself, that would industrialize and modernize the whole world. And you say you standing on a foundation? No, that's my back. Oh, it's obvious that we can expand on the land. No, there's some people there. There's indigenous peoples there. There's some babies there and women and men there. Let's have a Socratic dialogue. We're not talking about cheap PC chit-chat. I know my right-wing brothers and sisters, the old Brother West, you always sounded so anti-American. No. I'm anti-injustice in America. I'm anti-injustice in Guatemala. I'm anti-injustice in Russia. I'm anti-injustice in Ethiopia. And it has something to do with being a revolutionary Christian, which means I'm much more tied to the cross than the flag. I'm a cross bearer before I'm a flag waver. And that cross signifies unarmed truth, and the condition of truth is always to allow suffering to speak. That cross signifies unconditional love, and justice is what love looks like in public. Just like tenderness. Just like tenderness is what love feels like in private. I come from a people who taught the world so much about militant tenderness. Genius from Georgia talks about try a little tenderness, named Otis Redding. Or a tenderoni, or a baby face. No, tenderness is no plaything for a hated people. Tenderness is no plaything for any human being. Sweetness, that's what soul is, a sharing of a soothing sweetness of a hated people against the backdrop of catastrophic bleakness. That's what soul stirring is, a Lou Rawls and Sam Cooke and Johnny Taylor, of a Nina Simone, of Aretha Franklin. Of course, here we in Philadelphia, so we got the love train of the OJs and Phyllis Hyman. These are not just entertainers. I tell the young generation that all the time. They present Beyonce to me. I say, oh, Beyonce's unbelievable. She's a great entertainer. She got control of her body, her money. Probably a little control of Jay-Z too. But does she stir the soul of the young people? Not just their aspiration to be Black Bill Gates, as in her lyrics and formation, but she's stirring the soul at the deepest level, the way Aretha and Mahalia and Carmen and Billy and Ella did. It's not a put down of Beyonce, it's a situation of her in a cultural, superficial spectacle tied to money and image. She empowers. I got a daughter in love with her, so she always brings critique to bear on me when I say these things. She gonna ask me today when I pick her up, did you have that critique of Beyonce again? Well, I tried to nuance it, baby, but Because we have old school in regard to education. If it's sonic education, musical education, we got to learn from the younger generation, but they got to learn we got something to bring too. We got some insights too. And it's ways in which we're concerned about the shaping of their souls so that the formation of their attention is focused on integrity, honesty, decency, courage, and a willingness for them to pass on what they have received to the younger generation when we are far, far off the scene, when the worms have got our bodies. Now, the question these days is, do we really have what it takes? Because we got ecological catastrophe. The global warming is intensifying every moment. Just look at Philadelphia today. I know it feels good because it's 50 degrees, but this is not good for the planet, y'all. We got folk in power in denial of it. We got nuclear catastrophe. Our young folk are dealing with forms of nihilism and cynicism that are thicker and thicker every moment of their lives. And then they've got the economic catastrophe. When I was the age of many of the young people in the schools where you all teach, 1% of the population owned 21% of the wealth. Today, 1% of the population owned 42% of the wealth. It's a massive transfer of wealth from poor and working people to not just the top 1%, but the 0.001%. We were told in the report, 8 individuals in the world have wealth equivalent to 3.6 billion. Half of humanity. 8 folk. You can get them all here on the stage. Shake each one on the hand. Okay, appreciate it. So you made a lot of money. And then 3.6 billion of God's children have wealth equivalent to those 8. And it's getting worse. He said, can it get any worse? As my young people tell me all the time, Brother West, you always talking about this hope. I don't think it can get any worse. Don't you realize that this legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. and others is played out? It's all about dog eat dog. It's all about survival of the slickest and the fittest. Don't tell me that stuff anymore. It brings tears to my eyes. I said, no. You take a shortcut, you still end up running against the wall. Emmett Till's mother looked at her baby in Chicago, and they told her, you got to start terrorizing some folk because they've been terrorizing you. She said, no, I don't have a minute to hate. I will pursue justice for the rest of my life. I'd rather be defeated with my integrity than win and be a thug and gangster like these gangsters who killed my son. That's my tradition, even though it looks impotent and weak so often. And that's what we have to provide our young people with. Some examples, not just the discourse, but examples. I've given up telling folk they ought to have hope. It's too abstract. I say you gotta be a hope. Gotta exemplify it, enact it. People would rather see sermons than hear them. What are you willing to give up? What cost are you willing to pay? How are you willing to cut against the grain? That's the question. But preserving your own distinctive voice, no matter what color, gender, sexual orientation, national identity. That's a major challenge. But it has been the challenge of every generation for the community that produced me. Even with the black president, magnificent symbolic celebration, unbelievable breakthrough. But people still caught hell. Still needed a Black Lives Matter movement under a black president. Because too much of the symbolic celebration went hand in hand with concrete hibernation. Had folk break dancing in the air but sleepwalking on the ground. Where's the witness? Along with the acknowledgement of the progress. But Malcolm X reminded us what? You don't stab folk in the back 9 inches, pull it out 6 inches, and celebrate your progress. We acknowledge the breakthroughs, but not just the glass ceiling breakers, but those caught in the basement. They are the measure of any democratic project. When de Tocqueville came and wrote the greatest work in the history of this nation, about this nation, and democracy in America, where did he begin? In the prisons. He and Beaumont said, we are studying the prisons first. They didn't go to the stock market first and see the Dow break 20,000. They didn't go to the vanilla suburbs. They didn't go to the Harvard, Yales, and Princetons. They went to the prisons first. They wanted to see how the children were being treated. They wanted to see how the elderly were being treated. Let's see how the white workers are treated. And then that last powerful chapter in that first book on indigenous peoples and black folk. The undemocratic elements in American democracy. That's 1835. Almost 200 years later, that French aristocrat still presents a challenge to us, given his commitment to Paideia. And that's why I'm sure you all still read de Tocqueville in your works. Very much so. I've been going for a while. I want to end on a blue note. Because now that the nation unequivocally, undeniably has the blues, it may be the case that we either learn something from a blues people or you lose your democracy and end up with a neo-fascist regime. And the best that the blues people have ever had, 4 questions. How does integrity face oppression? What does honesty do in the face of deception? What does decency do in the face of insult? And what does courage do in the face of brute force? And that's the blues. B.B. King steps up with his guitar and says, nobody loves me but my mama, and she might be jiving too. Playing it with Lucille. You can hear echoes of Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith and Robert Johnson and Lightning Hopkins. BB, how you do it? Where you get that smile? Where you get that style, BB? Don't you realize you in the face of catastrophe? We know you come out of gut bucket Jim Crow, Mississippi, but you still got that hope in you, but you don't talk about the hope. You enact the hope, and it's in your music. That is the blues. It's a narrative of a catastrophe, lyrically expressed, but doesn't allow the catastrophe to have the last word. That love train still flowing, empathy train still flowing, justice train still flowing, not because it has a high chance of winning. It's not just about being on the side of the winners, something that the president is obsessed with these days. He's got to win. He's got to be smart. He's got to be rich. That's the sign of profound insecurity, adolescent mind, and very much a childish rather than a childlike disposition toward the world. BB is an adult. He's grown up. He's not Peter Pan. He's mature. He's been educated, not in college, but colleges have gone through him in terms of how he's holding on to integrity, honesty, decency, and he's just one voice among others. Thank you all so very much. We'll have time for questions and answers.